141. In the ESV, it's entitled Give Ear to My Voice, a Psalm of David. It's on page 522, if you're looking for it. Psalm 141, reading the whole psalm. O Lord, I call upon you, hasten to me. Give ear to my voice when I call to you. Let my prayer be counted as incense before you, and the lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifice. Set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth. Keep watch over the door of my lips. Do not let my heart incline to any evil, to busy myself with wicked deeds in company with men who work iniquity, and let me not eat of their delicacies. Let a righteous man strike me. It is a kindness. Let him rebuke me. It is oil for my head. Let my head not refuse it. Yet my prayer is continually against their evil deeds. When their judges are thrown over the cliff, then they shall hear my words, for they are pleasant. As when one ploughs and breaks up the earth, so shall our bones be scattered at the mouth of Sheol. But my eyes are towards you, O God, my Lord. In you I seek refuge. Leave me not defenceless. Keep me from the trap that they have laid for me, and from the snares of evildoers. Let the wicked fall into their own nets, while I pass by safely. Our second reading today is from the New Testament. It's the book of Hebrews. It's Hebrews chapter 12. And it's just verses 1 to 3. So that's on page 1008 in the ESV, Pew Bibles. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. So far the reading. The sermon that I'm privileged to read today is actually a sermon by the Reverend John Westendorp, who was here just last week. So this will be a faint shadow of the live thing, and I won't hope to try and impersonate John, but this is one of their sermons that is on. You can find a lot of these sermons on the Christian Reform website under Word of Salvation if you go looking for sermons to read. You can search under John Westendorp if you want to find his older sermons. So this sermon's by John, and it's based on those texts we just read, and it's called Prayerfully Resisting Temptation. Brothers and sisters in Christ, some people are quick to claim that the Bible is irrelevant for modern living. They see a huge gap between the people of biblical times and us today. They live primitive and simple lives in agricultural communities. We live in a fast-paced, industrialised cities with all their complexity. They lived thousands of years ago in times of ignorance and superstition. We live in an age where science claims to answer all of our questions. So how can the Bible possibly help us in the 21st century? People who say that have obviously never studied the Psalms. This collection of songs faces us with a whole gamut of human emotions. If you're sad, you'll find a song to match your mood. If you're happy, you'll find some songwriter who shares your joy. If you're confident and assured, you'll certainly find a psalm full of optimism. The Lutheran writer Marva Dawn is a seriously handicapped lady. She has struggled long with loneliness and depression. but she found in the Psalms wonderful resources to help her with her difficulties. She shared the help she found in those Psalms in a book, I'm Lonely, Lord, How Long? The point is that when it comes to the human condition, nothing much has changed. So the message of the Bible is as relevant for us as it was for Israel at the time of David. I want us to see that as we examine Psalm 141 and the subject of temptation. So the first part of this sermon is the reality of temptations to evil as portrayed. Temptation is not only something you struggle with today, David struggled with it too. David shows that the enticement to do the wrong thing was a stark reality for him. So we have this song that was recorded for singing in worship, but it also helps us to understand temptation, so that we might deal with it in a God-honouring way and for our own well-being. Temptation is real, but David shows that temptation is also attractive. The problem with temptation is exactly that it is so enticing to us. If it were not enticing, then it wouldn't be a temptation, would it? A dish full of potato peels and vegetable offcuts is not tempting for me to eat. But put a cheesecake on a dish and I'll be tempted to take a piece before dinner. Notice how David speaks of temptation in terms of enticement. In verse 4, he speaks of his heart being drawn to what is evil. So whatever evil he has in mind has something attractive about it that draws him in. He even speaks of these temptations in the language of eating the delicacies of evil men. Delicacies are food items that taste lovely and that usually have little or no nutritional value. There's a great picture of this in C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Edmund is enticed by the White Witch's Turkish delights. He eats it till it makes him sick, and he still wants more of the stuff, and he'll do anything to get it. We need to face up to the fact that temptation is attractive to us. It's like a delicacy. The alcoholic finds his drink irresistibly appealing. Angry people find it very attractive just to let their rage have full expression. The glutton is drawn repeatedly to food. Temptation involves what is attractive. If temptation is attractive, it's also subtle. That's another feature of temptation. It draws us in with great subtlety precisely because it becomes dressed to us as something attractive. Temptation's not usually surrounded by a lot of warning signs. There's no big write-up there that says, danger, temptation, keep clear. Instead, all the sign says is, come get me, I'm available. Actually, I should qualify this somewhat, and if the smokers amongst us don't mind, I'll use them as an example. Sometimes temptations are surrounded by warning signs, but we have the uncanny ability to dismiss those warning signs. We apply the warnings to others to give ourselves an exemption. Smokers are regularly tempted to light up yet another cigarette. The packets have a clear warning label, dangerous to your health. And these days, the packets are illustrated graphically by health disasters. But if I'm a smoker, I'm confident that I can beat the statistics. Do you see how subtle temptation is? It entices and draws us in because we don't think of the consequences. Or if we do, we kid ourselves that the consequences will be different for us. Do you understand why David talks about temptation the way he does then in verses 9 and 10? Keep me from the snares that they have laid for me, from the traps set by evildoers. Snares and traps entice, but they do so in a subtle way. They don't look dangerous. In fact, there is something attractive about them. But when the bait is taken, the trap springs shut. Temptations are attractive, but they end up wrecking lives. They are like an iron fist in a velvet glove, or like poison dressed up as candy. That brings us to our third feature about temptation that comes out in this song. David also spells out the end result of temptation. That's already obvious when he speaks about temptations in terms of traps and snares. In verse 10 he prays that the wicked will fall into their own net. Nets and snares are for the purpose of making a catch. When a trap springs shut, the idea is that the victim is caught. There are consequences to giving in to temptation, and the consequences are generally not good. In fact, the idea of being trapped is very appropriate. I'm thinking of addictions. When we keep giving in to temptation, you become trapped. In the Narnia Chronicles, Edmund becomes addicted to his Turkish delight. It seems to me that David has another angle on the result of giving in to temptation. Here I need to be careful. Verses 6 and 7 are notoriously difficult to translate from Hebrew. It mentions people thrown from cliffs and bones scattered at the mouths of graves. One view is that these words are about the hardships David is suffering, times of cruelty and oppression, and the temptation, therefore, is for David to get even. Our NIV translation, which obviously we've got the ESV, translates as another way that seems to make a lot of sense. It assumes those verses spell out the consequences of those who give in to evil. Judgment and destruction are the ultimate result of being entrapped by evil. So as we think about temptation, we always need to think about where it will lead. We need to look beyond the attraction of the temptation and think about the consequences. Which leads to the second part of the sermon, which is the remedies against temptation are available. This psalm gives us some wonderful help to work through the issues of temptation. Already in the things we have mentioned, it has been most helpful. If we understand the nature of temptation, then we're off to a good start. Realize that we give into temptation precisely because it gives us pleasure. Remember that it is subtle, and be aware of the subtlety of your temptation. Think through the fact that it has consequences and that it ensnares and traps. All that will help us to deal with temptation. However, David also mentions other helps too. First of all, there are other people who can be of great help to us. Sometimes a fellow believer can see the dangers that we are blind to. Or maybe someone else has been there and has experienced the sad result of giving in. That's one of the strengths of an organisation such as Alcoholics Anonymous. Experiences are shared. People are held accountable to one another. Folk can learn from the sad mistakes that others have made. Marva Dawn, in the book that we mentioned earlier, highlights the advantage of other people. She says that loneliness often makes it easier to give in to temptations. Some solve their loneliness and depression by giving in to the temptation to eat. Others solve their loneliness with inappropriate sexual behaviour. Still others turn to the bottle or to drugs. Here David not only mentions other people but also the special role they play. He imagines here someone rebuking him if he gives in to temptation. And that rebuke is not easy to handle. David speaks of it in terms of the man striking him. The book of Proverbs puts it this way: faithful are the wounds of a friend. God helps us handle temptation by putting us into a believing community, and in that community that belongs to Jesus, we take responsibility for one another. A second remedy for resisting temptation is prayer. In fact, that's what this song really is, a prayer song to the Lord. David lays this whole issue of facing temptation open before his God. It's worth noting that in this prayer there is a stress on urgency. Temptation is not something you linger over to take time with. No, there is a sense of urgency. "Oh Lord, I call to you, come quickly to me." He appeals for God to give speedy help. Hear my voice, not later but now, when I call to you. So here in this crisis of facing a severe temptation, David asks for God's help. He has made this a matter of urgent prayer. And that's an excellent model for us to follow when we feel the pressure of temptation, whatever those are. to cry out in that instance with David, "O Lord, I call to you, come quickly to me, hear my voice when I call to you." When I consider this prayer in time of temptation, then I think of Paul. In his letter to the Ephesians, he discusses our spiritual warfare and what is fighting temptation, if not engaging in spiritual warfare. But Paul reminds us that for that battle, we need the armour of God. And then he concludes by telling us that each part is to be put on with prayer. Prayerlessness is the surest way to succumb to temptation. A third remedy against temptation has to do with our focus. Anyone who has ever seriously battled a temptation knows the importance of focus. The more you think about the problem, the stronger the temptation usually becomes. The compulsive eater is fully focused on the food. Angry people are totally focused on the source of their anger. The sexually immoral are focused on their lust. Whatever the focus is becomes our all-consuming passion. And the stronger the focus, the more consuming the passion. And the more consuming the passion, the greater the chance of succumbing to temptation. So the secret is to change the focus. And the sooner the focus is changed, the greater the ability to resist the temptation. So what does David do? Well, he not only prays, he makes sure his focus is healthy. Verse 8, "But my eyes are fixed on you, O sovereign Lord." David's focus is on his covenant Lord, Yahweh, who is in total control of life. In fact, David is so strongly focused that there he takes his refuge in his God. It's as if this is the shelter from the storms of temptation that assail him. In times of temptation, where is your focus? Learn to make it your Lord and not in your problem. The writer to the Hebrews puts this into perspective for us Christians. Temptation is part of that hard struggle to run the Christian race. And in that struggle, we are told to fix our eyes on Jesus. Our focus is to be Jesus, the author and finisher of our salvation. And thirdly, in this sermon, there's the contents of prayer against temptation. Because this is a prayer, I want to conclude by looking at what David actually prays for. As we ask about the content of his requests, let's look at three things. First, David asks God to do what we are unable to do ourselves. Look at some of the things David asks God to do for him. He recognises that temptation can involve the words we say. That's a special temptation for some. We call it foot and mouth disease. The temptation to gossip, the temptation to use bad language. Here's a special prayer for God to do what we cannot do, to control your tongue. Set a guard over my mouth, O Lord, keep watch over the door of my lips. He also asks God to deal with his heart, the core of his being where wrong attitudes arise, the place where those impulses to sin come from. And he asks God not to let his heart to be drawn to what is evil. In verse 9, he prays to be kept from those snares that tempters have laid for him. What I find particularly beautiful is the emphasis on God's grace in all this. He compares his prayers to the incense offered in the temple that rises to God in heaven. And in typical Jewish style, he prays with hands lifted up to heaven to receive from God. But he asks that those uplifted hands may be like the evening sacrifice. This same language of incense sacrifice is also used for prayer in Revelations 5 and 8. That seems intentional. We have no inherent right to come before God. It's only by grace. We approach God only on the basis of an acceptable offering. Ultimately, that offering is the work of Jesus, who now brings our prayers before the Father. It's only on that basis that we may ask confidently for God to deliver us from temptation. A second thing David prays about is that man. I'll say that again, put my teeth back in. A second thing David prays about is that man who rebukes him. That too he talks about to God and how necessary that is. Here too grace must dominate. God hears our prayers to help us in temptation by his grace, only as our prayers arise like an acceptable evening sacrifice for Jesus' sake. But that same grace of God also has to be there between people. We receive their rebuke only by grace, as God enables us to do that. If you doubt that, just think through that for a minute. What's the natural reaction when another Christian tells you a few home truths? I've been told in no uncertain terms, why don't you just mind your own beeswax? That's our natural tendency, isn't it? Most of us don't handle criticism too well, not even if it's true. It's only God's grace that enables us to cop rebuke from others when we do go astray. Then we realise that the Lord himself is ministering to us through him. Do you see why David includes this in his prayers? It's only by God's grace that David can accept it. In fact, then he can even regard it as a kind of healing oil poured out on his head. Then he will not refuse it. In our prayers, we need to pray for the grace to accept the rebuke of others. And that's particularly the case if we have an ongoing struggle with temptation. Finally, David's prayer is also a prayer against those who are leading him astray. He says in verse 5, "Yet my prayer is ever against the deeds of evildoers." Notice that the focus is first on their evil practices, and that's a good topic for prayer. But it's a topic that I'm sure we take up far too rarely in our prayers these days. When did you last pray against the deeds of evildoers? I confess that I don't do that very often, perhaps only in certain extreme situations. I don't often pray against drugs or gluttony, against gossip and blasphemy. Praying against irrational anger and hatred, against prostitution or pornography, isn't a high priority for me. But I'll tell you something, if I did pray against those things regularly, they would be far less likely to ever tempt me. So by praying that way, I'm not only asking God to deal with that wickedness, I'm also keeping my own conscience more finely tuned about those things. But David goes further. He prays not just against the deeds of evildoers, he prays against the evildoers themselves. In the closing line of his prayer, he asks that the wicked might fall into their own nets. Lord, please let their temptations backfire on them. I'm not sure that David is asking in verse 10 for the destruction of these people. Perhaps he's just asking that they might get a dose of their own medicine, that they might see what it's like to be ensnared, caught in an addiction themselves. It seems harsh and unloving for David to pray that way, then please keep in mind, God is not glorified when his people are led into temptation and do wrong. And the spiritual well-being of his people is compromised every time they or we succumb. So then, let's fight temptation this week by focusing on Jesus and praying for his victory in his power and grace. Amen.